Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. Big stories and great guests for you this evening. I'll be talking about carbon capture and storage with the co-director of Greenpeace UK. That's following an announcement from the Labour Party that they're investing £22 billion in the controversial technology. And I speak to the director of a powerful new documentary for Al Jazeera on Israeli war crimes in Gaza. We'll close the show by talking about the BBC's most biased interviewer. See if you can guess who we've decided it is. Later in the show as well, I'll be joined by Bastani. You'll be pleased to know, relieved to know it wouldn't be a Friday evening without my colleague, Aaron. For the first time in 5 years, Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, has delivered a Friday sermon in central Tehran. The address comes 3 days after Iran directed a missile barrage towards Israel.
The operations carried out by our armed forces was the least as a response against the Zionist occupation in return for the heinous crimes perpetrated by this bloodthirsty criminal entity. Any and all the responsibilities of the Islamic Republic of Iran will be fulfilled fully and completely. And in performance of our responsibility, we will not falter yet, but we will not act irrationally. We will not act out of impulse. We will take the necessary action according to the directives handed down by our political and military leadership. As was the case in the past, it will be in the future.
So that was Khamenei saying Iran will fulfill what he called its responsibility to defend Palestine and Lebanon against Israeli aggression. He was also highlighting there that Iran would respond in a measured way. I suppose that was trying to both reassure, I imagine, many Iranians who aren't looking for a war and the international community. Some of the other things he said would be slightly less reassuring to Western governments. The appeal for Muslim unity commemorated Hassan Nasrallah, hailed Hamas's October the 7th attacks as a legitimate act, and said that Israel won't last long. Meanwhile, the Iranian foreign minister has been in Beirut visiting the Speaker of Lebanon's parliament. Sky's John Sparks was there.
The Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, really significant. I mean, you don't see him in settings, you don't see Iranian ministers in settings like this very often. And he also did a very short press conference as well. That is rare. The significance of this, well, you know, it's all about reassurance here, reassurance to their allies, Hezbollah. I think also significant another way that he was actually here physically, because he would consider himself, his security detail would consider himself to be a target. You've got the Israelis carrying out bombings, missile strikes as we talk, as we speak, in the southern suburbs of Beirut, and he is here in the center. He was meeting with the Lebanese speaker. As I said, it's all about reassurance. You know, I think there's this assumption, particularly in the West, that Iran represents the HQ in the so-called axis of resistance, while Hezbollah are there, in essence, employees in the field. And obviously, it's much more nuanced than that. The Shia community here in Lebanon, many people upset. They think Hezbollah, it's doing the fighting, it's paying the cost of war on the front with Israel, while the Iranians, they sit on the sidelines and they pledge their support but aren't fully involved. And that's what this meeting was about. He was here in person pledging his support to the country, also to Hezbollah. And he said multiple times in his short press conference that Iran stands with the resistance.
So, Aaron, interesting situation here. You've got sort of Khamenei doing a rare sermon, a rare public sermon in Tehran. You've got the Iranian foreign minister in Lebanon. Obviously, I suppose I include myself in this, when many people sort of saw that missile barrage going from Iran to Israel on Tuesday, I kind of expected there to be immediate retaliation. We're still in this sort of limbo period where it's not clear how Israel is going to respond. What do you see is going on here?
There was immediate retaliation, Michael, but the point is the retaliation was against Lebanese and Palestinian targets, civilian targets. They bore the brunt for the wounds that Israel endured several days ago with that ballistic missile attack. Khamenei, yes, he rarely gives a sermon on Friday prayers, but that's a common public practice for leading members of the clergy to effectively make these political pronouncements at Friday prayers in Tehran or Qom. That's very common. That's been very common for a very long time in Iran, even preceding the revolution in 1979. What I think is really important here, and again, it's going to be lost, I think, in much of the coverage of this big story across Western media, is that Khamenei is actually a relatively cautious, risk-averse figure. Now, if I say that on Twitter, I get deluged with a bunch of people going, "Right, he's a nut job, he's a wacko, how could you say that?" He is a cautious figure. Generally speaking, people who've accumulated power and have had to fight hard to win it and to keep it are cautious people. They don't want to give up what they've got. Some of the most rational actors in the world, actually, are people often painted as unhinged psychopaths in charge of countries. But in the case of Khamenei, it's particularly true. You have various factions in Iranian politics, one of which is the Revolutionary Guard. Their extraterritorial forces are called the Al-Quds. Quds, of course, Jerusalem. So it's pretty clear what their alleged political mission is. It's to liberate Jerusalem one day. And Khamenei has very much been the person, and the people around him, his clique, they've very much been the people in Iranian politics over the last 20 years, arguing for restraint, arguing against the construction of a domestic nuclear capability. Other factions in Iranian politics have said that's exactly what we need to ensure regime stability, security. Until we have that, we may be destroyed. And I think this is really key. I guess to his final point about how Israel hasn't got long. The brutal reality is, for Iran, that Israel is immeasurably more powerful than they are. Now, you might think, how could I say that? Iran has a ton of gas, a ton of petrol, big agricultural power, 90 million people, these impressive ballistic missiles. Israel has F-35s. Israel has nuclear weapons. Israel has a blank check from the world's leading economic and military power. So when you weigh those two up against one another, it's quite clear who is in the driving seat. And Iran knows that. And Khamenei knows that, which is why he's been a voice for moderation and restraint in recent decades. And gradual, iterative improvement, gradual geopolitical gains in Iraq after the 2003 war, in Afghanistan after the removal of the Taliban, in Syria after the 2011 uprising and civil war. The IRGC a little bit more gung-ho. So he is that restraining voice, comparatively speaking, because he knows Iran can't win a face-to-face war with Israel. Iran's super weapon, so to speak, is to be able to close down global oil and gas supplies by shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, by hitting refineries in the Arabian Peninsula. It doesn't want to do that, because the minute it does that, it's going to make an enemy of the entire region. And people like Saudi, Qatar, UAE, less Qatar, but UAE, Kuwait, they will have a massive interest in getting rid of the present regime in Tehran. That's not the case right now. No, right now, they're people they can at least work with. So he is a moderating voice. You're not going to hear that much in the media. And ultimately, Iran doesn't want to have to use its ace card, because if it does, then the regime is probably living on borrowed time.
Yeah, just on the missile attack, I need to make a correction. Yesterday in passing, I said that Iran had used 20% of their missiles. Someone in the comments told me that was false. It is false. I don't know where I got it from, actually. According to a sort of an American report in 2021, they have 3,000 missiles. It could be more than that, could be less, presumably not less. And they shot 180 to 200. So they have, they've used much less than 20%, less than 10%, in fact. A sort of another update on that sort of missile barrage, which I found interesting. Mark Urban, who was the diplomatic editor at Newsnight, shared a image of where the missiles struck on an Israeli airbase. And he says, this is very interesting. My main takeaways from Iran's missile attack: many, perhaps most missiles hit their target, but they are not accurate enough to hit a specific building or aircraft. So one of the buildings was the Mossad headquarters, and also they intended to destroy aircrafts. And he says sites like Nevatim, so that's the airfield, big and lots of concrete, suffer limited damage from near misses. But if Iran aims at large, fragile sites like oil plants or airports, damage could be considerable. So I thought that was very, very interesting in terms of what we've learned from that missile barrage, which is that, you know, Iran can get missiles to Israel. They're sort of accurate enough to hit an airbase, not accurate enough to hit a headquarters, and they can do considerable damage if they hit something which is a bit more fragile than a military airfield, such as he's saying, oil plants or airports. Let's go to another clip, this time from Lebanon. This is a report by Sky's Alex Crawford focused on emergency workers.
Emergency workers across Lebanon are feeling under attack. We're in one of the target areas in the south. Dozens of civil defense officers have already been hit by Israeli airstrikes. Colleagues in the south and in Beirut have been killed. And they told us of repeated attacks carrying out rescue operations.
There was a strike today. The first team went to rescue them. They were hit. Another team went to rescue them. They were also hit. At the end, the Red Cross went to rescue them, and they too were attacked.
Life for a rescue worker is an increasingly risky one in Lebanon now. 7 killed in one hit in Beirut. Emergency workers are meant to be protected under international humanitarian laws. But these repeated attacks all over the country have convinced them they are the target.
We've 40 ambulances which have been completely destroyed. On top of that, 24 rescuing stations just in this area. They were all targeted directly. And I'm just speaking about our organization.
Now, and I suppose this seems scarily familiar, doesn't it? You've got emergency workers saying they feel like they're being targeted, you know, not just sort of collateral damage, a horrible word anyway, but being specifically targeted by the Israelis, and then talk of, an emergency vehicle getting bombed, then someone coming to help them getting bombed, then someone coming to help them getting bombed. It seems like we are seeing a similar playbook as we saw in Gaza in Lebanon. And I wonder what you think about that, and also what we might be able to, I suppose, infer from that in terms of Israel's strategy.
Well, inference is a dangerous thing, of course, because you might have motivated reasoning. If you're not particularly keen on Israel, you would say that this is on purpose, and it's following the same playbook as Gaza because the same intention is there. That is to ultimately harm, destroy a significant part of the civilian population under attack as an act of political intimidation. At the very least, if you don't think it's about ethnic cleansing, I mean, you could make the argument about the desire for a greater Israel. You know, even since 1946, they wanted parts of Transjordan, parts of Saudi, parts of Egypt. There's a youth movement called Beta, and they have a flag of greater Israel. This is very much a live current in Israeli politics. But I don't think you need to go that far even to say that it looks like Palestine, because frankly, the IDF has very little problem with killing civilians. It was notable, wasn't it, that you had lots of these posters, these Zionist pro-Israel posters on Twitter. And they would say, Tel Aviv before and after Iran used these missiles, these ballistic missiles, and they looked obviously exactly the same. You know, it's the seafront of Tel Aviv or whatever, the best real estate you can find on the Mediterranean. And that's apparently meant to be a gotcha. Well, actually, I think most Iranians or people who are supportive of Iran would say, well, this is actually very much what they would want to do. Yes, they want to hit key military targets. Yes, they want to avoid civilian casualties. Yes, they don't want to hurt innocents, particularly women and children. You've had around 2,000 Lebanese killed in the last fortnight because of the IDF. 2,000 people. a good chunk of those people will be women and children. Some people have said as high as a quarter. I've seen other numbers saying somewhat lower. 2,000, Michael. You know, if we had 2,000 Ukrainians killed in 2 weeks by Russia, it's pretty clear what the response would be, rightly, by the way, what the response would be, or was, in fact, from European powers in the United States, Canada, and whatnot several years ago. But in this instance, it's crickets. It's not even actually an invasion. It's just, it's a quote unquote special military operation. Again, broadly analogous to what Putin was saying several years ago. And you even had a kind of shock jock pro-Israel figure talking about how Lebanon isn't a real country. It's a fake country, apparently, Michael. It's a staging post for the Revolutionary Guard. Lebanese people don't live there. There isn't a massive city of 1 to 2 million people in Beirut. No, it's just a fake country. And this is a problem for the whole region. Israel doesn't recognize borders when it's convenient for Israel, partly because it wants to be able to act with impunity with regards to extending its foreign policy interests, partly because it probably wants quite a lot of that territory. It quite fancies the Golan Heights, quite fancies the Sinai. I've already spoken about that greater Israel. And that's a very, like I say, live current in Israeli politics. So it's quite convenient to just ignore these borders. Oh, Lebanon's not a real country. It's just it's an aftermath of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Well, Israel's only been around since the 1940s. Is that a real country? Is it a real country that you've got, somebody speaking with an American accent, born in New York, calling themselves Israeli, saying this is my land as a result of, divinely revealed scripture? Has been for thousands of years. I mean, you think that's a real country, but Lebanon isn't. So look, it's the same playbook because there's a bunch of reasons involved. But fundamentally, the IDF, rather than being the world's most moral army, as we're repeatedly told, actually, of all the armies that are in NATO or in the OECD, have access to things like F-35s, which of course Israel does. It was the first country to import F-35s from the US before, I think, the UK. Of all those armed forces, Israel is by far the happiest to hit civilian targets.
The UK government has today pledged £22 billion over a period of 25 years to fund carbon capture and storage projects. The money will be invested in 2 industrial clusters, one on Merseyside and one on Teesside, and it'll be used to capture and store emissions from energy industry and hydrogen production. Speaking to the BBC outside a glass-making factory on Merseyside, Ed Miliband explained the government's thinking.
On Monday, the last coal-fired power station in Britain closed after 142 years, and that was the end of an era. Today, we start a new era with a new industry. As you say, carbon capture and storage. Why is this essential? Because for industries like cement, like glass, for oil refineries, if they are going to have a future, we can't let the carbon dioxide keep going into the atmosphere. We've got to bury it and store it underground. And that's what we're making possible today. Not just specific projects, but 2 kind of highways, if you like, for carbon capture in the northwest where I am and in the northeast. This is about good jobs across Britain, 4,000 good jobs just from today's announcement, the potential for 50,000 good jobs, world leadership for Britain, and a government willing to say, we do believe we've got to invest in the long-term future of the country to create good manufacturing jobs.
So you can certainly see the logic there, but many environmentalists are unconvinced. Friends of the Earth who oppose the scheme released this statement. Whilst millions of people are facing a winter of freezing in their heat-leaking homes, oil and gas executives will be celebrating. Rather than properly fund a home insulation scheme for those unable to afford it, this announcement essentially uses taxpayer money to subsidise the continued lifespan of the fossil fuel industry. The government needs a coherent industrial strategy to secure genuine green jobs and switch to clean energy. It must reject the false solutions peddled by the fossil fuel industry. The BBC put that statement to Ed Miliband. This was his response.
Look, the truth about this is that we are moving forward on offshore wind, onshore wind, solar. We've had the most successful renewable auction in history. But this is the right thing to do. Friends of the Earth are just plain wrong about this. The Climate Change Committee, our independent watchdog, says unless we have carbon capture, we are not going to decarbonise. Now, there is a choice, which is to let all of our industries go by the wayside, let them die, which would mean lots of people out of work, losing good jobs, or we can help them face the future. And that is the choice this government has made. Friends of the Earth are right about one thing. We do need to invest in home insulation, and we are going to do that as a country. But it isn't an either or. We've got to do both. We've got to create these good jobs for the future. We've got to have our industries be able to survive into the future. I'm not willing to say to the cement industry, well, you've got to go by the wayside because of climate change, or the glass industry, or to say to the oil refinery, you've just got to shut down straight away. This is about a transition, and it's about industries thriving in the future.
So, is Ed Miliband right? Earlier today, I spoke to Areeba Hamid, co-director of Greenpeace UK, and I began with a simple question. What is carbon capture and storage?
So carbon capture and storage is a new technology which aims to capture the emissions at the source from any of the industrial activities, anything that produces carbon emissions, and then bury them deep underground or under the seabed. So the idea is that instead of releasing the emissions into the air, which is causing the temperatures, global temperatures to go up, you could actually capture them and bury them deep under the ocean or underground.
And there's two different things, aren't there? So carbon sequestration is when you're not capturing it at source, you're just trying to get carbon out of the general atmosphere. Yeah. And carbon capture and storage is specifically when you're at a carbon dioxide producing place. So that could be a power plant or a cement factory. And you try and catch a lot of it before it goes out into the atmosphere. Am I correct?
That's right. Yes. So there's air capture, and then there is at source carbon capture and storage. So we're talking about, in this context, I'm assuming carbon capture and storage, for which a massive amount of funding was announced by Ed Miliband this morning.
And from what you've said so far, a multi-billion pound investment in carbon capture and storage sounds like something Greenpeace should be celebrating. Are you celebrating in the offices today?
I think we have questions before we can celebrate, like all climate campaigners. It's good to understand this fully. And also we have questions based on what we know so far about the technology. I can understand why on the face of it, it sounds like a really seductive idea. There's this magic thing, you can actually capture carbon emissions at the source and bury them, and they will never impact atmosphere anymore. It's strong. It's a strong pitch. But the history of carbon capture and storage has told us that actually it's not that effective. To scale up in particular, you can't do it at scale. You can't continue business as usual, for example, continue to emit at the levels that we are emitting as societies and globally, and think that carbon capture is one thing that will make the biggest dent. I haven't seen the detailed scientific analysis behind the claims that have been made by this announcement. And I also think that there are alternatives that are much more proven at scale and in effectiveness that might be better served by this kind of funding.
So as far as I understand, and as I say, I'm not an expert on this, there are sort of certain uses which we shouldn't really be sort of deploying carbon capture and storage for. So we shouldn't be saying, we don't need to transition to renewable energy because we'll just keep our gas and coal plants and we'll capture the carbon dioxide anyway, because one, that's quite expensive, and two, it's not necessarily going to be that effective. But it does seem, and what Ed Miliband was sort of laying out this morning, is that there are some industries which it is very difficult to decarbonize. So cement, glass, I think steel is quite difficult to decarbonize, isn't it? So are there sort of industrial sectors where carbon capture and storage, sort of despite the uncertainties about the technology at the moment, where it would be very useful, and so therefore sort of investing in innovation so that it can work at scale would be necessary to get to net zero?
I think that there will be a role for carbon capture. Both the Climate Change Committee and the International Energy Agency says that there will be a role in those industries, like you say, where it is really impossible to move away from fossil fuel altogether in the short term or in the medium term. So glass is one, cement is one, but I think we also haven't taken into account how much it's an expensive technology, worth saying, how much it would then drive up the cost of these things. So would anybody actually buy the glass that has been produced by capturing emissions and storing them? Does it drive the price of the glass, and will anybody buy it? Who has done that feasibility study? On steel, it's interesting because it is possible actually to produce steel with green hydrogen, which will not create emissions, so you wouldn't have to capture them in the first place. So the way I'm trying to phrase it, I suppose, is solving the last problem first. There are lots of other alternatives. We could, for example, invest that kind of money in offshore wind supply chains, in jobs, in port expansion, in updating the grid. We haven't seen numbers on investing in those things, which are essential to move away from fossil fuels. And we wouldn't need carbon capture if we moved away from fossil fuels at scale and fast enough.
And I suppose from my perspective, and again, as I say, someone who's, I don't claim to be an expert on carbon capture and storage, but I'm generally quite positive about investments into innovation. And I know you say this is solving sort of the last problem first. Why don't we do the easy stuff first? But if you think about the fact that climate change, I mean, basically the future of climate change is not really going to be determined by whether or not we insulate our homes in this country. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, by the way. Absolutely, we should be doing it. But it is going to be determined by the kind of industrial practices they use in India and China, because those are countries which are developing, going through a different stage to ourselves, and they have every right to, in my view. So if the UK were to be able to pump loads of money into developing something which can make industrial production more green, then would that not be potentially one of the most high impact uses of our money?
Like I say, there are other things that are better use of the money. India and China, for example, we could help them by investing in transition that helps them leapfrog away from the technologies that they are dependent on. I mean, this is the first time that China stopped building coal power plants at the pace that they were building the first quarter of this year, which is incredible. The Central Bank of India said that coal will not be energy mix, such a big part of energy mix in India in 2030. So there are ways in which these countries are already making the first efforts to walk away from fossil fuels. Renewable energy is a proven technology. It is scalable. It is scalable, and it is effective, and it is happening fast. And that's where I would want the UK to invest money, both domestically and globally.
Do we need to be investing money in sort of solar? Because I suppose, and could this relate to sort of carbon capture and storage, which is, once upon a time, solar was very expensive and you might have to invest a lot in it as a government. But now what we keep being told is that solar is cheaper than the other alternatives. So presumably we don't need much government money going into solar. And could there not be an argument that sort of pumping billions of pounds into a very new technology is a good use of money, because the market won't do that? As you say, carbon capture and storage is very, very expensive at the moment. So is it not in those difficult areas, which is precisely where the government should be pumping taxpayers' money?
Solar is cheap, and it is cheap not just because the cost of manufacturing it came down. It is also because the governments invested and gave subsidies and there was a private-public partnership where government said, well, we'll put 50% of the money if the private companies put 50%. And we are not actually totally resolved that problem now, because our grid is not fit for purpose. Even if we were to have all our energy coming from renewable sources tomorrow, the national grid has already said that it needs an upgrading before we can actually supply that energy. I highly suspect that India and China are also few steps behind that. So I think we need stable, scalable, efficient, cost-effective measures, and those already exist. Like I said, in this country on offshore wind, outside this country in solar, in technology, upgrading that technology. Carbon capture will be a part of it, a small part of it, but I think that slightly there is for me, a missing piece in terms of how does it interconnect to all those other solutions.
Yeah, I suppose just to be clear, I mean, you're being very clear here in general, but for my benefit, your beef with carbon capture and storage, is it principally that the money could be better spent, or is it that you're worried that a development or investment in carbon capture and storage could be actively bad? Because I know some people are suggesting that this will be used to enable sort of dirty industries to continue, whereas they might otherwise have, well, I suppose, either ended or gone green in a different way.
So 3-point refrain, I suppose. One, it's unproven at scale. It's still new. It's still expensive. 2, it can be better spent on alternatives that exist, alternatives that probably make the use of carbon capture even less viable. And number 3, that we actually some people will use it for perverse purposes. The oil and gas companies want to continue business as usual. They need to be regulated. They need to be told. They have thrown away their renewable targets, however pitiable they were. And there is a little bit of a space for using it perversely to continue business as usual instead of moving away from fossil fuels fast.
And finally, we're 3 months into a new Labour government. How are Greenpeace feeling about it?
The early signs are optimistic. I think, as usual, we will continue to be critical friends to the government. I think the fact that Cumbria coal mine, the government withdrew the support, the fact that sewage and water companies are being regulated, the fact that 2 of the North Sea oil and gas new licenses, the government withdrew their support, Rosebank and Jackdaw. Those are all very encouraging signals. David Lammy gave a speech and said he wants to make climate and nature center of foreign policy. Really encouraging. Carbon capture, ? I think we will continue to hold them to account where we think that more is needed. But I think there are there are things to be optimistic about.
Al Jazeera has released a new feature-length documentary investigating Israeli war crimes in Gaza. And the main evidence it draws from are the videos and photos taken by Israeli soldiers themselves.
The West cannot hide. They cannot claim ignorance. Nobody can say they didn't know.
Regarde, je vais te montrer son dos, tu vas rigoler, regarde. Ils l'ont torturé, on va faire parler.
Lots of people say Israeli forces shouldn't be allowed to take cameras and phones into combat. I'm glad that they are allowed to, because it allows the world to witness what's happening.
I think that's a really important documentary. It's out on Al Jazeera's YouTube channel. And earlier today, I spoke to its director, Richard Sanders, and I began by asking him why he chose to focus on footage shared by Israeli soldiers.
It seemed to us such an extraordinary phenomenon. I mean, increasingly in conflicts in recent years, we've been getting footage from soldiers on the ground. I mean, 20 years ago in Iraq, I was getting hold of footage that soldiers had shot, but it was nothing compared to this. In this social media age, it was happening instantaneously. Soldiers were just posting themselves on Facebook and on Instagram and so on the whole time. And it gave us an extraordinary insight into the conflict in Gaza. What seemed to us astonishing was that the Israeli authorities and the Israeli military were taking no steps to stop them from doing this. Apart from anything else, it seemed very undisciplined. I mean, you would have thought there are issues of operational security, but also these videos showed the Israeli military in such an appalling light. And it struck us that it was terribly important to actually tell the story of this conflict through the messaging that Israeli soldiers were putting out. I mean, they always say, if someone tells you who they are, believe them. And in this case, Israeli soldiers were speaking to us very loudly and clearly.
And can you talk about some of the footage that you found sort of most notable? I imagine most people will have seen sort of some clips from Israeli soldiers on social media, but what sort of really shocked you while you were researching this documentary?
In a way, let me start, first of all, by talking about what you don't see in these clips. There is almost no combat footage. That's what's quite remarkable. There's very, very little combat footage. Every now and then you'll see them sort of spraying gunfire everywhere. But even in those situations, they're standing up and there's clearly no incoming. It's something that appears to be being done for the most part for the cameras. Now, in terms of what they do show, you have a sort of ascending scale. There's a lot of sort of pretty unpleasant, but ultimately fairly trivial stuff. There's a lot of recurring jokes. They do this thing where they knock on a door, no answer, they pull back, and you see that the house behind the door has been completely destroyed. They do this joke endlessly. They do mock tours as if they are an estate agent. There's also this remarkable phenomenon of rifling through women's underwear. They seem to be obsessed with Gazan women's underwear. I don't know why this is, but there's a lot of showing off women's underwear, putting women's underwear on. You then graduate to rather more serious stuff. And I think within that, there are sort of three main categories. An awful lot of destruction. You see them simply smashing up people's houses, just with hammers and just throwing things around and so on. You see them setting fire to houses. The thing you see more than anything else is explosions, detonations. The wholesale destruction of whole apartment blocks, whole areas of cities. And they almost seem to be competing with each other for the bigger bang they can put onto YouTube and TikTok or whatever. I mean, I've had people who know about these things look at these videos where they are rigging these buildings for explosives. And they say there's massive overkill. They're using anti-tank mines, which are far more powerful than you need to actually do the job they're doing. Also very important, if you are in a building rigging it for explosion, for detonation, there is no threat from that building. Self-evidently, there is no one within that building. You then progress to the treatment of detainees. I think a lot of people will already have seen a lot of this, the stripping naked of detainees, the humiliation of detainees. Again, they seem to be entirely unembarrassed about putting this online. And in fact, Israeli media has published extraordinary reports, being quite open and clear about the treatment of detainees in detention centers. We then progress finally to videos, a much smaller number of videos, where you can quite clearly see unarmed individuals being shot by snipers. Now, of course, we don't know the context of those shootings, but the individuals are quite clearly unarmed. And that they should put these videos onto YouTube, as they do in this particular instance, is quite extraordinary and speaks to an astonishing sense of impunity.
One thing you do in the documentary is you identify some of the people in these videos. So there are videos, some of them I'd seen already online, but what you do is you find out who the person in that film shooting themselves doing something, or sort of filming themselves doing something appalling, who they were. And I suppose, why did you think that was important? And did you sort of find that there was any outcome to having identified these people? Sort of did the Israelis take action against them, for example?
No, I mean, the Israelis, as usual, haven't responded at all to any of our queries. We're rather hoping that our film will be useful to prosecutors in the long run and to investigators in the long run. I would say, I was anticipating a lot of hard work doing geolocation, facial recognition, and this sort of thing. But actually, you don't need to. I mean, they post these things on their own Facebook accounts, their own TikTok accounts, and so on. And they quite often tell you where and when it was shot. So they're being absolutely open about it. They're an open book.
This amount of footage, is this just something about war fought in the modern world, or is this something about this war specifically? And I suppose, tell me why this might be, but I haven't seen, for example, much footage from Ukraine and Russia sort of shot on people's phone. Now, obviously, there are differences between these wars, but I suppose, do you think there is more video footage, self-shot video footage coming out of this war? And what does that tell us, if so?
Of course, you do see quite a bit coming out of Ukraine, and what comes out of Ukraine is often quite upsetting. It's combat footage. It's quite graphic combat footage, which is what you're not seeing from Israeli soldiers in the Gaza Strip. Now, I think it's a phenomenon of the modern age, the social media age, the fact that everyone has an iPhone with them. But I think it is a product as well of the fact that the authorities simply don't discipline them. Neither the government nor the military have taken any serious steps to stop this from happening. Now, in the film, we show this footage to a British Army officer. He says, apart from anything else, it compromises operational security. I mean, had he returned from a day's operations in Afghanistan or Iraq and found his men loading things up to their Facebook page, he'd have stopped it immediately and probably disciplined them. So again, it speaks to a certain indiscipline, institutional indiscipline in the Israeli military, and just this astonishing sense of impunity.
And finally, you made this documentary with Al Jazeera. I suppose I want to know sort of the politics about different media organizations here. Do you think you could have made a documentary like this for, say, Channel 4 or the BBC, or was this only possible because you were working for a media organisation that's not based in the West?
Yes, I could never have made it for the BBC or ITV or Channel 4, perhaps 30 years ago, but no, absolutely impossible.
And I suppose could you expand on why? Is that just because they wouldn't like the politics of it, or why would that not be possible?
The great liberation we have at Al Jazeera in coming to Israel and covering the whole area of Israel is we don't have to indulge in this rather bogus and limiting both sidesism. It's been pointed out many, many times, although without much effect, that there is no equivalence between an all-powerful occupying power backed by the world's only superpower and a completely prostrate, powerless, occupied people. There is no moral, political, or military equivalence between those two sides. Now, in this conflict, if you actually just look at the casualties, let's take the issue of babies. In our previous film, October the 7th, we looked very closely at these allegations that large numbers of babies had been killed. 2 babies were killed on October the 7th, which is a terrible thing, but it was 2. In the Gaza Strip, the health ministry released detailed figures a few weeks ago. Now, of the bodies where they have documentation, they've firmly identified them, the first 14 pages were taken up with children under the age of 1, 701 names. That doesn't include the 7,000 bodies where they don't have documentation. It doesn't include the 10,000 or so of people who are buried under rubble. It doesn't include people who have died of malnutrition, people who have died from lack of access to healthcare and medicines. So, we're probably looking at over 1,000 babies, children under 1, compared to 2 babies on the other side. There is no equivalence. Now, the BBC, when it does you look at a BBC report on Gaza, it will standardly do it'll do a report on a family which perhaps have a child, a young person captive in the Gaza Strip, and their very real anguish and trauma. That will be set against a bombing in the Gaza Strip where perhaps 30, 40, 50 people have died, many of them children. Now, if you are really going to set up an equivalence between those two things, then you are buying into a fundamentally racist arithmetic. And at Al Jazeera, we don't do that.
So the film is on Al Jazeera's YouTube channel. It's called Investigating Israeli War Crimes, directed by Richard Sanders, who I was speaking to there. The BBC does a lot of decent journalism on Israel's war against Gaza. In particular, its journalists on the ground in the region produce high-quality reports on the human costs of war. But some of their journalists, and especially those here in London, do not meet that high standard. And one radio host in particular this week put all of her pro-Israel bias on show. On Wednesday, Emma Barnett interviewed the Israeli ambassador, Tzipi Hotovely, and gave her an incredibly easy ride. The following day, she interviewed the Lebanese ambassador, and well, the difference could not be more stark. Let's start with Barnett's interview with Tzipi Hotovely.
What can you say of the impact and how many missiles got through and were not intercepted?
I think the most important thing to remember that 182 Iranian rockets were targeting Israeli civilians. This is the most important thing because sometimes we are checking whether people got killed or didn't get killed. No, the intentions matter. And the intentions of the Iranian regime was to target Israeli civilians in a massive attack. I don't think Britain would have coped with 182 rockets direct to London, to Manchester, to Birmingham, to your main cities. This is what happened yesterday.
The reason I was asking about the impact is to understand, I suppose, as well, not to take away from the aim, what the impact has been, whether people have been injured, lost their lives, to get a sense of that, as also when you then go on to talk about what your reaction will be.
So what's wrong with this interview so far, right? Well, the Israeli ambassador, a belligerent in the fighting in the Middle East, right? This isn't a neutral arbiter or a neutral speaker, says, as a matter of fact, that the intention of Iran was to target civilians. Now, Emma Barnett could have asked, what evidence is there of that, right? Because the only evidence seems to be that Iran, as well as targeting airfields, targeted one military building in a built-up area. So that was the Mossad in Tel Aviv. Now, of course, that's something that puts civilian lives at risk. But it's nothing compared to the civilian cost when Israel says it's targeting military facilities in Gaza or Lebanon, right? Now, that might have been something which was useful to bring up when you're talking to an Israeli politician. But Emma Barnett doesn't say that. She just accepts the premise. She says, quote, not to take away from the aim of Iran. So she's accepting there the premise from Tzipi Hotovely, which isn't evidenced and which is self-serving for an Israeli politician. Let's go back to that interview and let's see if it gets any better.
The Iranians will pay major price for what they did yesterday.
What does that mean?
It means they won't be able to fire again on Israel. It means that in the end of the day, Iran was creating this circle of fire around Israel with its proxies, and we are eliminating the proxies one after the other. We eliminated Hamas, we are eliminating Hezbollah, and we will make sure that Iran won't have capabilities to hurt Israeli people, just like it's been doing for the last 40 years. We're speaking about 40 years of aggression.
Now, Tzipi Hotovely there is expressing a desire that would undoubtedly spin the Middle East into all-out war, right? She's expressing a really extreme aim, saying Israel won't rest until Iran doesn't even have the capacity to fire at Israel. Now, the idea that a country shouldn't even have the capacity to make war, that's incredibly extreme. We'd be in a sort of permanent state of war if that's what we expected of any international rivals, that they didn't even have the capacity to strike each other. That's why we normally go for diplomatic solutions. But she's completely rejecting any kind of diplomacy. And that might have been worth challenging, right? A tough interviewer might also have challenged Hotovely's claim that Iran is the biggest source of instability in the region, right? Might Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine have something to do with instability in the Middle East? Well, this was the follow-up from Emma Barnett.
You talked there about the response. The leaders have stood with Israel that you have mentioned very, very clearly, and not least America. But there is also urge for restraint. There is also concern about all-out war in the region. Are you saying that that's what your intention is now?
Our intention is to protect our people. We didn't choose those wars. Those wars were imposed on Israel by Iran and its proxies. And it's Iran that is escalating. It's Iran that is attacking. It's Iran that is firing. We cannot confuse here between the victims and the aggressors. The Iranians are the aggressors. The Israelis are the victims of this attack. And I want to say again, I don't think Britain would have accomplished the idea that rockets coming from a country overseas will be targeting Londoners and people, the Britons in this country. No country would have agreed to that.
And if I was interviewing a British leader in that scenario, I would be asking this question, which I just tried to ask: is there going to be all-out war? Is that the view of the Israeli leadership right now? Is that the goal?
Actually, the opposite. I think when Israel is eliminating those terror proxies of Iran, we are minimizing the problems in the region.
So Israel is minimizing the problems in the region by starting a regional war with Iran, by carrying out what the International Court of Justice thinks could be a genocide in Gaza, right? That was completely insane, what Tzipi Hotovely was saying. And also, I think the thing that I find most pernicious there is Tzipi Hotovely is very clearly, sort of trying to insert an idea in the minds of the audience when she says, what would Britain do if a city like London or Manchester was being bombed, right? She's saying, we are like you. Now, Emma Barnett didn't say, well, what would we do if London was being bombed in the same way that Gaza City was being bombed, right? There was no attempt whatsoever to push back against that completely one-sided narrative that we were getting there. And just the idea that they are doing this to bring peace to the Middle East, right? You had all the Arab leaders a couple of days ago, we showed you the clip earlier in this week, saying, look, Israel's neighbors don't actually want to make war with Israel. What we want is for them to stop their 50-odd year illegal occupation of Palestinian territories, right? Lots of the Arab countries have actually accepted the existence of Israel. What they want to end is the continued ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and Gaza, right? And Israel won't agree to that. And you could have, as a radio host, brought that up. You know, maybe the instability is coming from the fact that you're choosing land over peace. But no. And this is how Emma Barnett, in fact, challenges those completely outrageous statements from the Israeli ambassador.
It's just, there will be, those listening to this very concerned about all-out war. I know you talk about the fact that by eliminating these different proxies, these different threats, it will make the region better. But in order to get to that point, if you were to accept what you've just said, there's going to be a lot of lives lost, a lot of carnage, a lot of difficulty.
If you were to accept what you just said, she's clearly accepting it. She's just accepted everything else that Sibi Hoteveli has said in that interview, right? Completely bizarre. We are fighting Iran to make things more peaceful in the Middle East. We're going to war in Lebanon for the benefit of the Lebanese people, right? It's completely bizarre. It's completely topsy-turvy. And Emma Barnett's response is say, okay, yeah, let's accept that. Let's accept that. For the sake of argument, we'll accept that. Isn't it going to be difficult to get there, And what's that doing? That's posing the Israelis as people like us who have a noble aim to bring peace to the Middle East, but there's some sort of difficult trade-offs in how we get from A to B, right? Completely accepting the goal, but saying, aren't you a little bit worried that there could be difficulties when you try and get to what I'm going to accept for the purposes of this interview is a noble aim, right? Now, you might say, okay, maybe this is just an interviewing style. Some people think that you get better answers out of people if you sort of accept lots of their premises, if you're friendly with them, you put them at ease, instead of doing a sort of Jeremy Paxman style, constantly interrupting and trying to catch them out. Maybe Emma Barnett has a particular interviewing style, and she was just demonstrating that there. It was nothing to do with the fact that she seems to have a fair amount of sympathy with the Israeli argument. Well, you could say that if you hadn't listened the following day to Emma Barnett interviewing the Lebanese ambassador. Let's see how that went.
The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, says the UK stands with Israel and recognises its right to self-defence. To remind our listeners, Hezbollah is backed by Iran. Tuesday, we saw nearly 200 ballistic missiles go from Iran into Israel. And we've just heard there 100 rockets are going from Lebanon, from Hezbollah, into Israel. What is your comment of the UK's response to the crisis? Do you see it as commensurate?
Well, the UK has been saying since the early beginning that there should be a ceasefire in Lebanon and that a diplomatic solution should be sought. As for self-defense, I don't see how self-defense goes with posture of occupation. Israel has been in an occupation posture for decades now. So I think the concept of self-defense should be.
Self-defense goes with rockets being fired into its territories and thousands of people not being able to live where they live.
Well, it's clear that Israel has chosen an escalatory path in a very volatile and dangerous region. It opened a Pandora box, and we've said in the beginning that we would want to seek a diplomatic solution, and diplomatic solutions exist. We were on a track trying to discuss a diplomatic alternative to the current abyss, but the hotheads in Israel chose a different path. I think what we're saying today.
Would you describe Hezbollah as hotheads?
Well, Hezbollah, they have their modus operandi. It's a Lebanese matter. Now they are in a self-defense posture. But I think that the alternative to this exists, which addresses the concerns of everybody. If the real aims of the Israelis is to guarantee the return of their civilian population to northern Israel, we also have our concerns. We can put all these concerns on the table and address them in the framework of this Security Council Resolution 1701 that had worked well from 2006.
Hezbollah have to come to the table, don't they? And I wonder if your government's done enough to condemn Hezbollah and condemn its actions. You say Hezbollah is in a self-defense position. There is not a view of that by many who would view firing rockets and continuing to fire rockets into northern Israel as self-defense. They would view that as attack.
Literally, she's talking to the Lebanese ambassador and she asks him the question that, gets put to student activists, right? Do you condemn Hezbollah? Right? She hasn't listened to anything he's saying. And he's actually right when he was saying that Hezbollah were coming to the table to sign a ceasefire deal, right? We've heard that from all sides now, that actually there was a 21-day ceasefire that was being agreed between Israel, between Hezbollah, between the various allies of both. But Netanyahu walked away from it because he wanted to assassinate Nasrallah instead. And she said, well, will you condemn Hezbollah? Will you condemn Hezbollah? And then she's also putting this sort of imaginary view, which she didn't do to Tzipi Hotovely. She said, well, lots of people would say that firing rockets isn't self-defense. She didn't say to Tzipi Hotovely, well, lots of people think that the fact that you have been illegally occupying some territory for the past 50 or so years, and that you've killed 40,000 people, many of them, or tens of thousands of them, women and children. Many people would say that means that you're contributing to instability in the Middle East. That sort of imaginary, some people are saying, didn't get brought to the table when it was Tzipi Hotovely. It only gets brought to the table when it's the Lebanese ambassador. And the hectoring went on.
We want a diplomatic solution for this problem, and we still stick to this diplomatic solution. We have a Security Council resolution. We have the framework.
It doesn't matter, does it, if Hezbollah's not coming to the table?
No,
a ceasefire required.
They did come to the table.
While continuing to fire rockets.
So then she's changed her tune, right? She said they did come to the table, which they did. She said, okay, they did come to, while continuing to fire their rockets. Now, what does she think a ceasefire is? Right? The point of a ceasefire is you're fighting, and you're meeting to have an agreement to stop fighting. Now, the fact that you're firing rockets while negotiating a ceasefire does not mean you don't want a ceasefire, right? And I don't know why she didn't ask that to any of the Israeli guests. This idea, they weren't really looking for a ceasefire if they were still firing rockets. Like, this is really basic stuff. You can't say, they didn't want a ceasefire because they were still fighting a war. You wouldn't need a ceasefire if you'd stopped fighting a war. Right? It is completely bizarre, but she's talking to him like he's kind of an insolent child. And this is how the interview ended.
We're talking about since October the 7th, there has been a continuous barrage
October the 7th, there has been a genocide.
That is a reality, Rami Mortada. You're Lebanon's ambassador to the UK, and it's about what's happening at the moment. And you say Hezbollah are in a position of self-defense. That is a completely opposite view of those perhaps living in the north of Israel.
That's why we said there is a diplomatic solution that addresses their concerns, but we also have our concerns. On October the 7th, there was a genocide that started in Gaza. Conflicts in the region are contagious because the social fabric is shared by all the countries of the region. We need to stop this carnage in Gaza, stop this carnage in Lebanon, and seek a diplomatic solution. This expansion of the war theater does not help. It's pushing the region towards abyss. It's time to reverse the trend and look for a diplomatic solution. That's what we are saying.
Rami Mortada, we've got to leave it there. Lebanon's ambassador there. Of course, you say a genocide was started on October the 7th. October the 7th was, of course, the day that there was the biggest attack on Jewish lives since the Holocaust. I think it's an important point to put into that particular context. Rami Mortada, Lebanon's ambassador to the UK. Thank you.
So he gets this sort of phony correction at the end of his outro. Right. Thank you for speaking to me. By the way, I'm just going to add something which I think is important, which I think you got very wrong. Oh, bye-bye. Can't respond to that. Right. Tzipi Hotovely, the Israeli ambassador, did not get that. Also, the bit that really got me there, she was like, you are the Lebanese ambassador to the UK? Right? It's so patronizing. Alan, I want to bring you in on this. I was listening to, both of those live on Radio 4, and I was just, when I was listening to the Tzipi Hotovely one, I was sort of like, God, this is so... She's just really allowing Tzipi Hotovely to put forward all of this Israeli propaganda for 10 minutes without really any challenge. And then listening to the Lebanese ambassador being interviewed the following day, I was like, what the hell is going on?
Yeah, it's remarkable, isn't it? I mean, firstly, on the Tzipi Hotovely interview, she's saying, we've done nothing wrong. It's purely defensive. Israel is in the right. Everybody else is in the wrong. Let's just do a little bit of a roll call of the last 12 months. Israel has illegally invaded Lebanon. I think it's contravened international law in terms of what it's doing. 2,000 Lebanese have died in the last fortnight. It's killed at least 40,000 people in Gaza, maybe more than 100,000. You've had the continuation of illegal settlements in the West Bank. You had the illegal extrajudicial killing of Khamenei in Iran when he was there to see the inauguration of the new Iranian president. Go further back. Israel illegally developed nuclear weapons in breach of non-proliferation. Israel illegally occupies various parts of the West Bank and obviously Gaza too. It breached a whole ton of UN resolutions going all the way back to 1947, 1948. Illegal, unjust. And then, of course, Emma Barnett's talking about, well, you've got in Lebanon, Hezbollah are firing their rockets. Do you know how many Palestinians are in Lebanon? About 250,000. Not many people know this. Why are they there? They were ethnically cleansed. They haven't got a right of return, again, as is their right under international law, to go back to Palestine, which doesn't even exist. So, this is quite important context, you'd think. But the people who've been ethnically cleansed, who don't have a country even to return to, those are the baddies. The country which has been absolutely destroyed, Lebanon, by obviously huge floods of people going in. It's hard to manage a refugee population of 300,000 people when your population is 4 million in Lebanon. You obviously had that disaster recently, a couple of years ago, with regards to the explosion in Beirut. You've been invaded multiple times by Israel. You only got Israel out in 2006, 2000. You had the war there in the early 1980s. Horrific civilian casualties suffered by the Lebanese. But the Lebanese are the bad guys. The Lebanese are the bad guys. Sorry. Zippy Hotaveli, they're the good guys. The ethnic cleansing, they're the good people. Now, I don't want to talk about good guys and bad guys because actually you have fanatics in all kinds of places around the world. We can all do good or bad things. The State of Israel was founded fundamentally on a desire to ethnically cleanse large numbers of people. However, I don't think that justifies killing civilians as is what happened on October the 7th, of course. But Emma Barnett's choice of words and her inability to provide bigger, broader context for the audience is really key. Is really, really key. And even that point about the biggest number of Jewish deaths since the Holocaust. I mean, this is how no sensible person, Michael, no serious sensible person can compare Hamas to the Third Reich and the Wehrmacht. Arguably the most vicious, effective military machine Europe has ever created. And you're comparing it to people who on average are 19, 20 with little homemade rockets. But of course you have to do that. You have to create that comparison in order to legitimate killing 2,000 Lebanese in 2 weeks, in order to legitimate killing 100,000 people in Gaza, in order to legitimate extrajudicial killings of the political leader of Hamas in Tehran, killing diplomacy staff of Iran and Syria. You could go on infinitely with this stuff. The killing of nuclear scientists in Iran, in Tehran by the Mossad, Stuxnet virus. These are all breaches of international law, but international law doesn't exist for Israel. And of course, in order to create a license for that, an alibi for that, you have to create this idea that somehow Hamas is as dangerous as the Third Reich and the Wehrmacht. And as I've said repeatedly, Iran, which is of course a major regional player, can't lay a glove on Israel. It can disincentivize what it's doing in Lebanon. It can, make the costs very high, but ultimately it can't destroy Israel. Israel has nuclear weapons. Israel has F-35s. Israel has the Mossad. Israel has an open blank check from Washington. It has tens of billions of dollars of aid when it needs it, when it asks for it, okay? But somehow it's represented by people like Emma Barnett. I'm not saying she did it right there, but people in the media class that give that kind of performance as if, Israel is moments away from decimation and destruction. Unless they can kill civilians with impunity, then it won't exist anymore. And you have this strange contradiction with Israeli politics. We want to be a normal country. Israel is meant to be the land of Jewish people. They have a right to self-determination, just like anybody else. We just want to be normal. Well, normal countries don't breach international law 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. They don't go around killing diplomats. And by the way, it's not just, you might say, well, Iranian diplomats in Syria. I don't care. There was a Scandinavian diplomat, a human rights diplomat, who was tasked with trying to solve the problem of Israel-Palestine, Bernadotte something, I can't remember. In 1946-47, he was tasked with trying to sort this out as part of a broader UN mission. He was assassinated because he was trying to create a fair settlement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. He was killed by far-right Zionist militias, okay? The King David Hotel bombing, 91 people died, I think in 1947, including many British service personnel. Hundreds of British soldiers died in the Mandate of Palestine, killed by the Irgun, the Lehi, the Stern Gang, far-right Israeli Zionist militias. Hundreds of them. And yet, apparently, those people were fighting for civilization. They were holding back the Muslim hordes. The slightest engagement with the history, with the reality, with a little bit of scholarship, reveals all of this stuff to be complete and utter nonsense, which is why, to borrow a term from Steve Bannon, Israel and broadly the Zionist lobby has to flood the zone with shit. Because if we have a sensible, informed, calm debate, they haven't got a leg to stand on.
Yeah, I think that's all really important points. I suppose the reason that interview got to me so much is just because I've never seen a clearer example of someone sort of interviewing a sort of Western-aligned politician and speaking to them as if they're a legitimate voice, and actually being quite. She deferred to her, essentially saying, "Okay, I'll accept your premise. I'll accept your premise there." Being really, really respectful. And then the moment you're speaking to a politician from a country that's not a Western-aligned nation, you're speaking to them like they're some sort of uppity student activist. I thought it was just quite racist, really. Aaron Bastani, let's wrap up there. It's been a lively Friday evening as ever.
It's been a pleasure, Michael. Another week in the news. Looking forward to next week too. By the way, Michael, I'll just say this. If you don't like what the BBC is doing, support Novara Media, because we're going to make waves when it comes to covering this stuff for the next 5-10 years. And if we don't, I don't think anybody else is going to do it. Certainly not in the UK. Certainly not the BBC.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously agree with that. Although, and I do always like to say, there are lots of journalists on the ground who work for the BBC who I do think do a good job reporting from all around the world. I think it is especially these sort of journalists in Westminster, in central London, who seem to kind of mess it up. Thank you, everyone, for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow don't come back tomorrow. That would be terrible. Come back on Monday for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.